He thought he could humiliate the new student with impunity, but he could not even imagine how it would turn out. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments what city you are from. Jaden stepped through the towering iron gates of Crestwood Academy, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. The prestigious private school loomed before him, its red brick facade imposing under the crisp morning sun. Everything about this place screamed wealth and exclusivity: the polished hallways, the pristine lawns, the students who strolled confidently as if they owned not just the school, but the world itself. He tightened the straps of his backpack, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on his shoulders. His father had sacrificed a great deal to enroll him here. This was supposed to be his chance at a better future. But from the moment he entered the hallway, it became clear that he was an outsider. The way heads turned, the way voices hushed to whispers, the way eyes darted toward him, then away, as if he were something to be observed but not acknowledged. His dark skin stood out starkly among the sea of pale faces. It wasn't just that he was new, he was different. And Crestwood did not seem like the kind of place that welcomed differences. Jaden found his assigned classroom and took a seat near the back. He didn't expect a warm welcome, but the cold silence around him felt heavier than he anticipated. He focused on unpacking his notebook as the teacher walked in. Mr. Grayson was a tall, lean man with silvering hair and sharp, calculating eyes. He wore a tailored suit, his every movement exuding precision and authority. The room quieted instantly. The lesson began, but didn't take long for Mr. Grayson's gaze to land on Jaden. He narrowed his eyes, tapping his fingers against the podium before speaking. "Since we have a new student among us," he said smoothly, "perhaps he'd like to demonstrate his understanding of today's material." Jaden straightened in his chair, sensing the way the other students subtly turned to watch. He was being tested. Mr. Grayson scrawled an advanced algebra problem on the board, stepping aside with a small, expectant smirk. Jaden stood, walking to the front of the room. He analyzed the equation quickly, picking up the chalk with steady fingers. The classroom was silent except for the soft scratching of chalk against the board. When he finished, he set the chalk down and turned. Mr. Grayson's expression barely changed. He studied the answer for a moment before nodding curtly. "Correct," he said, but there was no praise in his voice. "Take your seat." A few students exchanged looks. Jaden knew what they were thinking. He wasn't supposed to have gotten it right. Class continued, but Jaden could feel the scrutiny on him. At lunch, he took a seat alone at the edge of the cafeteria. He barely had time to open his sandwich before a shadow fell over his table. He looked up to see a group of boys standing there, led by a blond student with an easy, smug grin. "You're sitting at my table," the boy said. Jaden glanced around. The table was mostly empty. "There are plenty of seats." The boy laughed, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't a school where you just pick a seat and fit in." Jaden stared at him evenly. "Then I'll move." But as he stood, the blond boy's hand shot out, knocking the milk carton off Jaden's tray. White liquid splattered across his shirt, dripping onto the table. Laughter erupted around him. Jaden clenched his fists, willing himself to stay calm. He had been through this before. He knew how this went. He was supposed to react, get angry, lash out, so they'd have a reason to call him the problem. Instead, he grabbed a napkin, wiped his hands, and turned away. "Coward," the boy muttered, but Jaden ignored him. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the unease lingered. He didn't care about the milk-stained shirt. He cared about the message that had been sent. He was not welcome. By the end of the week, the harassment escalated. The boys found small ways to disrupt him. A shove in the hallway, a whisper behind his back, a stolen notebook. The more Jaden ignored them, the bolder they became. And Mr. Grayson, he saw everything and said nothing. It wasn't until Friday afternoon that things finally snapped. Jaden was walking to his locker when he felt a hard shove from behind. He stumbled, colliding with the row of lockers. His books tumbled to the floor. "Oops," a familiar voice drawled. Jaden turned slowly. The blond boy, Derek, stood there, arms crossed, smirking. Behind him, his friends snickered. Jaden exhaled sharply. "I don't have time for this." "Sure you do," Derek said. Then, without warning, he grabbed the collar of Jaden's shirt and shoved him again, harder this time. Jaden staggered back. He knew he should walk away. He knew that's what they wanted, to provoke him. But this time, something inside him refused to step back. He had done nothing wrong. He wasn't going to let them decide how much space he was allowed to take up. So he pushed back. It wasn't hard, just enough to make Derek stumble. But it was enough. A sharp voice cut through the air. "Jaden!" Mr. Grayson stood at the end of the hallway, arms folded. His expression was unreadable, but Jaden could already see where this was going. Derek recovered quickly, smoothing his shirt, feigning innocence. "He attacked me," he said. "I was just standing here, and he shoved me." Jaden felt his stomach drop. He opened his mouth, but Mr. Grayson had already made his decision. "Fighting is unacceptable," he said. "You're suspended." Jaden stared at him in disbelief. "But he—" "I don't want to hear it," Grayson interrupted. "My office, now." Derek smirked as Jaden was led away. The principal's office smelled like old books and disappointment. His father arrived within the hour, still in his work clothes, worry etched across his face. "He was provoked," his father argued. "You're punishing him for defending himself." Mr. Grayson remained unmoved. "I don't tolerate violence in my classroom," he said. "If Jaden wants to stay at Crestwood, he needs to learn that." Jaden clenched his fists. This wasn't about violence. This was about power. As he walked out of the office, head held high despite the unfairness of it all, he made himself a promise. If they wanted to test him, he would let them. But he would not break. Jaden sat silently in the car as his father drove them home, the low hum of the engine the only sound filling the tense space between them. He kept his eyes on the blurred city lights outside the window, his jaw clenched. His suspension was unfair, and he knew it. But what made it worse was the way Mr. Grayson had looked at him, like he had already decided Jaden's place before he had even spoken. His father's voice finally broke the silence. "You know you can't let them get to you." Jaden exhaled through his nose, still watching the passing streets. "So, what am I supposed to do? Just let them push me around?" "They want you to react," his father said. "The second you do, you give them exactly what they need to justify keeping you down." Jaden knew he was right. That was the way it always worked. He had grown up understanding that the rules weren't the same for everyone. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. When they got home, Jaden went straight to his room, tossing his backpack onto the floor. His textbook sat on his desk, still unopened from the week. He knew that if he let himself fall behind, it would only make things worse. Crestwood was a school built on reputation and competition. If he didn't prove himself here, they would find a way to push him out. But how could he prove himself when the system was already set against him? His father knocked on the door but didn't step inside. "Come out when you're ready. Dinner's on the table." Jaden didn't move. Instead, he reached for his math book and flipped it open, staring at the complicated equations in front of him. He liked math because it was supposed to be fair. Numbers didn't care about who you were or where you came from. The answer was the answer, no matter what. The next morning, he walked into Crestwood with his head high, ignoring the whispers and smirks that followed him. He could feel the weight of the stairs pressing into his back as he stepped into Mr. Grayson's classroom. The teacher barely acknowledged him as he took his seat. Jaden had been here long enough to recognize the way the classroom worked. The smartest students sat at the front, answering questions, gaining favor. The privileged ones took their places near the middle, coasting by on their family names. The ones who didn't belong were either ignored or, like Jaden, made an example of. As the lesson went on, Jaden forced himself to focus. He ignored the side glances, the whispered remarks from Derek and his friends. He had made a decision last night. He wasn't going to let them win. At the end of class, as students gathered their things, Jaden stood. His voice was steady when he spoke. "I want to take the regional exam." The room stilled. A few students turned to look at him, amused or surprised. Mr. Grayson barely lifted his gaze from his desk. "You'll take whatever exam I assign, Mr. Carter." "I mean the scholarship exam," Jaden said. "The one that qualifies students for college funding." This time, Mr. Grayson did look up. His expression was unreadable, but Jaden could see the flicker of something behind his eyes. Annoyance, disbelief, maybe even amusement. "And why do you think you belong in that competition?" Jaden's stomach twisted, but he didn't let it show. "Because I can pass it." The classroom was deathly silent now. Even Derek looked entertained. Mr. Grayson leaned back in his chair, considering. "Is that so?" Jaden didn't flinch. "If I score in the top percentile, I want you to apologize, publicly." A few muffled laughs rippled through the room. Mr. Grayson's lips twitched slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "And if you fail?" Jaden swallowed. He knew what was at stake. "Then I'll leave Crestwood." Now, the room wasn't just entertained. They were intrigued. The idea of watching someone like Jaden either rise or crash and burn in front of the whole school was better than any class drama they could have imagined. Mr. Grayson stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Fine, you have 3 weeks." Jaden could feel his heart pounding, but he simply nodded and sat back down. He had just put everything on the line. After class, a familiar voice caught up to him in the hallway. "You really think you can do this?" Jaden turned to see Thomas, one of the smarter students in their grade. He wasn't a friend, exactly, but he wasn't like Derek either. He was the type who lived for academic prestige, who cared about winning trophies and proving he was better than everyone else. "I don't think," Jaden said. "I know." Thomas looked at him carefully. "You've got a lot to catch up on. Grayson's been prepping the top students for this for months. You don't just walk into that exam and ace it." Jaden met his gaze. "Then I guess I better start walking." That night, he dove into his books like never before. He mapped out everything he needed to learn, every weak spot he had. The library became his second home. He stayed up until his eyes burned, running equations over and over until they became second nature. The only thing that mattered now was proving himself. Thomas started showing up at the library, not offering help outright, but studying alongside him. He would casually slide practice problems toward Jaden, making sure they were the hardest ones in the book. Jaden never said no. He solved each one, pushing himself further every night. Days passed, and the pressure grew. Derek and his friends mocked him in the hallways, but Jaden ignored them. Even Mr. Grayson seemed to be watching him more closely, waiting for him to crack. The exhaustion wore on him. His father caught him asleep at his desk more than once, shaking his head but saying nothing. Jaden knew he was worried. He also knew this was the only way. One evening, as Jaden sat in the empty library, Thomas leaned back in his chair, watching him. "You know," he said, "part of me wants to see you fail." Jaden raised a brow. "And the other part?" Thomas hesitated. "The other part wants to see what happens if you don't." Jaden didn't respond. He didn't need to. He already knew the answer. The night before the exam, he stared at the ceiling in his bedroom, exhaustion pressing down on him. He had done everything he could. Now, all that was left was to prove it. At breakfast, his father set a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. Jaden barely had an appetite, but he ate anyway. "You ready?" his father asked. Jaden nodded. His father studied him for a long moment before setting a firm hand on his shoulder. "Then go show them what you're made of." Jaden stepped onto the school grounds with his head high, blocking out everything except the single thought running through his mind. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to waste it. Jaden sat in the exam hall, his pencil poised above the first question. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but he forced himself to focus. Around him, the other students had already begun, their heads bent over their papers, the only sounds in the room the quiet rustling of pages and the occasional scrape of a chair against the polished floor. Mr. Grayson stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, his gaze sweeping across the students like a hawk surveying its prey. Jaden knew the man was watching him closely, waiting for a mistake. The first question was deceptively simple. A basic algebraic equation meant to lull students into a false sense of security. Jaden solved it in seconds and moved on, his pencil gliding across the page. The next question was trickier, requiring multiple steps and careful reasoning. He took a deep breath, blocked out everything else, and began working through it systematically. Minutes turned into an hour, then 2. His fingers ached from gripping the pencil so tightly, but he didn't stop. He didn't dare. The challenge wasn't just the difficulty of the questions. It was the pressure, the knowledge that a single mistake could cost him everything. He had staked his place at Crestwood on this exam, and there would be no second chances. Halfway through, he glanced up briefly, catching sight of Thomas a few rows ahead. The other boy was working with the same intense focus, his brow furrowed in concentration. Jaden knew Thomas was one of the top students in the class, but for the first time he wondered if they weren't so different after all. They were both fighting for something, even if their reasons weren't the same. As he turned back to his exam, a quiet scoff reached his ears. Derek was sitting a few seats away, his smirk barely concealed as he glanced over at Jaden's paper. Jaden ignored him. Derek wanted him to lose focus, to second-guess himself, to panic. But Jaden had spent weeks preparing for this, had pushed himself beyond exhaustion for this moment. He wasn't going to let Derek or anyone else take it from him. Time slipped away too quickly. When the proctor announced that they had 30 minutes left, Jaden's heart pounded in his chest. He had finished most of the exam, but the final section loomed before him, a series of complex problems designed to separate the truly gifted students from the rest. He clenched his jaw and dove in, forcing himself to think faster, to work smarter. 15 minutes left. He scratched out a miscalculation and corrected it, double-checking his reasoning. 10 minutes. A wave of exhaustion crashed over him, but he shook it off, powering through the last question. 5 minutes. He set down his pencil, exhaling shakily. His brain was fried, his body tense with adrenaline, but he had done it. The proctor's voice cut through the silence. Pencils down. Time's up. Jaden leaned back in his chair, his heart still racing. Around him, students exchanged glances, some relieved, some anxious. He felt a bead of sweat roll down the back of his neck. It was over. Now, all that was left was to wait. As the exams were collected, Jaden met Mr. Grayson's gaze. The teacher's face was unreadable, but something in his eyes made Jaden's stomach twist. He had a bad feeling about what was coming next. The next morning, Jaden arrived at school earlier than usual. His body was sore from stress and lack of sleep, but he couldn't afford to slow down now. The results were supposed to be posted outside Mr. Grayson's office in 2 weeks, but something told him that the teacher wouldn't wait that long. He was right. Halfway through the day, he was called to Mr. Grayson's classroom. He walked in to find the teacher seated at his desk, a single sheet of paper in front of him. "Sit down, Mr. Carter." Jaden hesitated, then did as he was told. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with something he couldn't quite name. Mr. Grayson picked up the paper and studied it for a moment before looking back at Jaden. "I assume you'd like to know how you did." Jaden swallowed. "Yes, sir." For a long moment, Mr. Grayson said nothing. Then he placed the paper face up on the desk and slid it toward him. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. A perfect score. His eyes flickered back to Mr. Grayson's face, searching for any sign of approval, but there was none. If anything, the teacher looked irritated. "You defied my expectations," Mr. Grayson said finally, his voice measured. "I'll admit, I didn't think you had it in you." Jaden clenched his fists beneath the desk. He should have felt triumphant, but something about the way Mr. Grayson spoke made his victory feel hollow. "I suppose this means I owe you an apology," the teacher continued, his lips pressing into a thin line. "That was the deal, wasn't it?" Jaden nodded, keeping his expression neutral even as his heart pounded in his chest. He had won. Mr. Grayson exhaled sharply through his nose. "Very well. Tomorrow, in front of the school." Jaden stood. He didn't thank Mr. Grayson. He didn't need to. The exam results spoke for themselves. As he stepped into the hallway, students were already whispering. News traveled fast at Crestwood, and it wouldn't be long before everyone knew. Thomas was waiting outside the classroom, his arms crossed. "Well?" Jaden met his gaze. "I passed." Thomas studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good." Jaden continued down the hall, ignoring the way Derek and his friends stared at him as he passed. For the first time since stepping foot in Crestwood, he felt something close to belonging, but he also knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Tomorrow, Mr. Grayson would have to admit publicly that he had been wrong, and Jaden would be there to make sure he did. Jaden arrived at school earlier than usual, stepping through the front doors with a quiet sense of determination. The whispers had already spread through the halls like wildfire. Students clustered in small groups, talking in hushed tones, glancing his way as he passed. They all knew what was coming. Today was the day Mr. Grayson would stand in front of the school and do something no one had ever seen him do before. Admit he was wrong. Jaden's locker was near the main hallway, and as he turned the corner, he caught sight of Derek leaning against the wall, arms crossed. For once, there was no smirk, no taunt waiting for him. Derek just watched him for a moment before looking away, like he wasn't quite sure what to say. Jaden didn't stop. He had nothing to prove to Derek. The results of the exam had done that for him. By the time the morning bell rang, the entire student body had gathered in the assembly hall. Rows of chairs filled the space, and the stage at the front, usually reserved for guest speakers and award ceremonies, stood empty except for a single podium. The air buzzed with anticipation. Some students were amused, others curious. A few, like Thomas, simply watched in silence, waiting. Mr. Grayson entered from the side, his steps slow and deliberate. He carried a small stack of papers, but he didn't glance at them. He didn't need to. Every eye in the room was already on him. The murmuring faded as he reached the podium. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and looked out at the sea of students before him. His gaze briefly flickered toward Jaden, who sat near the front, back straight, hands folded in his lap. "For those of you who are unaware," Mr. Grayson began, his voice steady but lacking its usual sharpness, "one of our students recently took the regional mathematics exam. Not only did he pass, but he earned a perfect score." A few scattered murmurs spread through the crowd, but they quieted quickly. Mr. Grayson's grip on the edges of the podium tightened. "I made an assumption about this student, an assumption that was incorrect." Silence filled the room. No one moved. No one so much as breathed. "I was wrong," Mr. Grayson continued, his voice measured, as though forcing out each word required effort. "Jaden Carter proved that he belongs here, not because of an obligation or a rule or a policy, but because of his intelligence, his dedication, and his ability to succeed where others would have faltered." Jaden kept his expression calm, but he felt the weight of those words settle into his chest. "I apologize," Mr. Grayson finished, his jaw set, "not just to Jaden, but to anyone who has ever been underestimated." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a single clap echoed through the hall. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding. Jaden exhaled slowly. It wasn't a victory parade. It wasn't the kind of apology that erased the months of bias and unfair treatment. But it was something. And sometimes, something was enough. As students began filing out of the assembly hall, Jaden remained seated, letting the moment sink in. He had done what he came here to do. He had forced them to see him, not as an outsider, not as someone who didn't belong, but as their equal. A familiar voice spoke beside him. "Didn't think I'd see the day." Jaden turned to find Thomas standing nearby, arms crossed. "You and me both," Jaden admitted. Thomas hesitated, then nodded toward the door. "We have class. You coming?" Jaden glanced towards the stage one last time, where Mr. Grayson was gathering his papers. The man's expression was unreadable, but something about the way he moved felt different. Maybe this had changed him, if only a little. Jaden stood, picking up his bag. "Yeah, let's go." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Some students still stared as he walked through the halls, but the looks were different now. There was no smirk in Derek's expression when they crossed paths at lunch. A few students who had never spoken to him before nodded in passing. It wasn't friendship, and it wasn't acceptance, but it was respect. And that was enough. After school, Jaden found himself in the library flipping through a textbook when a shadow fell over his table. He glanced up to see Mr. Grayson standing there, arms crossed. "You've proven your point, Mr. Carter." Jaden closed his book slowly. That wasn't the goal. Mr. Grayson studied him for a moment, then sighed. I assume you're considering your options for next year? Jaden nodded. He had always planned to go to college, but now, with the perfect exam score, doors were opening for him that he hadn't expected. Mr. Grayson pulled out a folded pamphlet from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table. Crestwood has connections with some of the best universities in the country. If you want recommendations, you'll have them. Jaden picked up the pamphlet and flipped it open. It was from MIT. He raised an eyebrow. You think I belong there? Mr. Grayson didn't answer right away. I think you belong wherever you decide to be. It wasn't praise and it wasn't encouragement, but coming from Mr. Grayson, it was the closest thing to both. Jaden nodded. I'll think about it. As the teacher walked away, Jaden leaned back in his chair, staring at the pamphlet in his hands. For the first time since stepping foot in Crestwood, he felt something unfamiliar settle inside him. It wasn't just relief or satisfaction or even victory. It was possibility. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out other videos on the channel and share this one with others who might like it.